How can philanthropy play a role in helping scale what works and create opportunities for organizations to try to improve upon and innovate so we're not just doing more of what we've always done? Now, I don't represent all of philanthropy. There are a variety of organizations that play a critical role in the creation, preservation, and management of affordable housing. Private philanthropy like MacArthur Foundation provides grants to housing advocates, housing researchers, and think tanks that bring together communities of practice, intelligent people to think about ways to try to innovate in this space. But there are other ways in which philanthropy supports housing development and innovation. Many of you may be familiar with impact investing. Indeed, it's hard to avoid the topic these days. And this field is rapidly growing as more and more investors look for ways to put their capital to use for public good. And the fields of affordable housing and community development are likewise expanding, having developed a range of proof points for what works to raise standards of living for people living in marginalized communities and help a wider range of households obtain stable housing that lets them thrive. Historically, the traditional capital markets and those ventures who are not seeking to maximize profits have not worked particularly well together. So perhaps the new investment landscape and impact investing as the tool du jour is as much as looking back to try to correct what's been wrong in the past as much as it is looking forward. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned at the MacArthur Foundation about the power of investing in mission-driven organizations, and particularly in affordable housing and in finance vehicles that support that work. And I hope as we head into our discussion and question and answer period, we can have a good conversation about what it takes to try to activate other investors to come into this space. So let me just start with a bit of background. So MacArthur Foundation, I always have to check this because of the stock market. Today we're the 12th largest foundation. Last week we were the 11th, so, you know. Real time there. So we have about $6 billion in assets. We've been involved with impact investments for about the past 30 years, primarily through the use of a PRI or a program-related investment. And bear with me because I always ask this because it's one of those wonky things. Are people familiar with PRIs? Some? Right. So basically, this is foundations can make loans and investments on terms that no profit-seeking individual or institution would make that investment, so long as it's furthering charitable purposes. So just that for context, because we talk a lot about impact investing, and I think it's really important to remember that there's a real scale for what that means. So from a philanthropy's perspective, what that typically means is a loan at 1% on an unsecured basis to a nonprofit organization, or a guarantee in a top-loss position in a loan fund or something like that. And most of what we've done, we began the work, as I say, 30 years ago, mostly investing in microfinance and community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. And many of those CDFIs were investing in affordable housing, which is what really brought us to this work that we're talking about here today. In fact, many of those initial investments were focusing, some, for example, in Chicago on home ownership and helping people who were first-time home buyers or who had blemished credit history be able to purchase homes. And then also investing in CDFIs like the Low Income Investment Fund, LISC, et cetera, that were helping provide both pre-development support as well as permanent financing for affordable housing projects. So that early work evolved significantly over the years, and today we've now dedicated about $500 million of our corpus to investing in impact investing. Primarily, as I said, through PRIs as loans, but we've also now done some equity transactions, guarantees, and then I'll talk about one of our new innovations that we've done later in this conversation. And really the innovation for us now is to try to think about ways to use our capital to bring other investors into this space who currently don't feel that they can come in because of the way that capital typically flows right now. And we'll speak more about that. But to just talk a little bit about the work with housing. When we first started making PRIs at MacArthur Foundation, we were very opportunistic. We took pretty much things that seemed interesting, that seemed like they'd have some impact, and we underwrote them. We lost a lot of money. We probably didn't make as much impact as we could have. Losing money, I like to say, this predated me. We actually invested in an organization in Central America, and a nun actually embezzled the money from the organization. Predated me, but you know, that's, you know you've sunk that low when, right? But one of the things that we learned, we did an evaluation early on, and after about the first 7 or 8 years of doing this, and the evaluator came back and said, you need to really concentrate your effort and try to embed the work that you're doing within specific programs. So the housing work was the first time that we really, from the beginning, said we want to use PRI capital as part of the theory of change for what it is that we're trying to do. So in 2000, we launched an initiative that's our largest initiative to date, called Window of Opportunity. It involved $187 million of grant and loan capital, and indeed it still remains one of our signature programs today. The goal of the Window of Opportunity program was to try to help support the preservation of affordable rental housing. As I like to say, that we're encouraging people to preserve stuff that looks like Mike Brady designed it, for those of you who remember the Brady Bunch, right? So that's, those of you under the age of 30 have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. But the goal was to say we knew from the research we had done that the nation was losing affordable rental housing faster than it was building it. We also knew that 30%, roughly, it depends on the year, of residents, of households in the United States live in rental housing, and that almost everybody will need to live in rental housing at some point. We saw rental housing as being a really critical piece of the national infrastructure. It facilitates household formation. It lets people move for jobs. If we don't have that stable housing stock of rental housing that's affordable for people who are in the lower end of the workforce, the economy itself suffers. We also felt that preservation was an incredibly important tool to help prevent displacement. If you look at what's happening in many cities across the United States with gentrification, being able to help nonprofits acquire properties that are in the path of gentrification, or help them keep a property that otherwise is in a community that is becoming unaffordable, becomes a really important way to make sure that people have opportunities outside of low-income communities. And we felt that this was an important tool to empower nonprofits to be able to deliver on. So as I said, through this initiative of $187 million, approximately $150 million of that was loans that we made to nonprofit organizations and also to loan funds, and $37 million of that was grants that we provided to housing advocates and also to a variety of researchers through an initiative, sub-initiative called How Housing Matters. And if any of you have not visited, I would encourage you to visit howhousingmatters.org, where all the research that we have funded through that, through 3 different rounds of funding, is available there. And the point of the research was to really talk about why housing is a platform for educational advancement, for better health outcomes. One of my favorite pieces of research was from Boston Children's Health Watch. Megan Sandell, if you're not familiar with her work, looking at how children, there you go, looking and saying that children actually ended up eating more vegetables because their parents could afford to buy fresh produce. Okay? This is an amazing thing. Nobody talks about this. I should say, we talk about this. General public doesn't talk about this. But ultimately, the goal of the initiative was to try to build a cadre of strong nonprofit organizations that would, again, be part of delivering upon this infrastructure within this country. And between 2000 and 2020, we hope those organizations would preserve 300,000 homes. The other piece of this that's really important for context, because we have to sort of go back and remember when we started this in 2000, and I worry that we may be getting back to that place right now. Home ownership was seen as the ultimate goal of any housing policy. And I hate the notion that people think of a renter as a failed homeowner. And I actually delivered that message to Ben Carson when I was at a meeting with him a while ago. I'm not sure it meant very much to him, but I felt the need to say it. So we really wanted to make these investments not just for the organizations to do things and not for just policy advocates to talk about people and why this was important, but also to try to help rebalance the conversation within the national policy context to say we need to make building and preserving affordable housing easier. And that was one of the reasons why we did this, was to try to support practitioners so they had case studies of why this work mattered, then be able to talk from a policy perspective, what are model policies that are being done across the United States that can be replicated, and then look at the research to say, why does it matter? Why bring it to ground? What does this actually mean for people? So since launching the initiative in 2000, as I say, we've invested in organizations, ones here in California, Bridge Housing, Mercy Housing, or ones that probably are familiar, but we've also invested in organizations all across the country in different markets, urban, rural, et cetera. Now, the housing that's being preserved, some of it is low-income housing tax credit projects that are reaching the end of their compliance period, and some of them are naturally occurring properties that organizations are looking to buy and preserve, again, as a way of trying to keep them affordable. And one of the things that's really critical that this capital that we provided these organizations, and again, our sort of standard loan, probably 1 to 3 million, 10 years unsecured at 1 or 2%. And it's really important to remember this is at the entity level. This is not at the project level. And I think that for those of us who spend a lot of time working in housing, we think of what happens at the project level and the project structure. And I love it. I'm a real estate lender by training, so I never met an asset I didn't want to put a mortgage on, right? But investing in organizations, this is betting on the jockey, not the horse, right? Investing in those organizations is really critical. And that's what we were trying to do here. But what it meant then was we were trying to give organizations flexible, equity-like capital that let them play in a marketplace around other well-resourced developers so they could act quickly, so that they didn't have to go and chase the pre-development loan for every transaction, so that they could hire staff in advance of a strategy for embarking on preservation, so they could put down earnest money if they needed to acquire a parcel that was or a property that was critical to an overall strategy. So when I talk about the importance of this kind of flexible capital, let me just give 2 examples. Mercy Housing in Chicago had a property. This was actually one of the things that we learned is that one of the challenges organizations had was to preserve properties within their own portfolio. So how do you keep a property that's reached the end of its compliance period, recapitalize it, et cetera? Mercy Housing had a property. It had been a market rate affordable property they had acquired. It was 100% occupied. It was essentially because people had lived there for so long, a naturally occurring retirement community, almost all men, 161 units in a neighborhood that was rapidly gentrifying on the north side. It desperately needed to be renovated. They wanted to keep everybody there. And every financing tool that they wanted to use had one problem with the way the project was constructed. It had shared bathrooms. Now, you can't have shared bathrooms with any 4% credits, bond programs, nothing like that. And because they had acquired it so long ago, this didn't have to comply. This building is 100% occupied. So now you're stuck. What do? They could have easily sold it to a for-profit developer, made a lot of money, and then they would have just thrown everybody out and they would have converted it to luxury properties. But because Mercy Housing had a PRI from us to do these types of transactions, they were able to take the time to be able to start the renovation, to work with the city, and to say, we need a waiver so that we can put residential units on the ground floor. They needed to be able to have space in other properties they could relocate people to and then relocate them back. And because they had capital that they didn't have to get permission with what to do with it, they were able to preserve that property without dislocating anybody and have it comply with all the financing. That's why this capital works. Because if they had to go to get a pre-development loan for that, it would have been gone. It would have been too late. Another example was another one in Chicago is a property that Preservation of Affordable Housing out of Boston was going to acquire. A property had an incredibly troubled history right in my backyard near the University of Chicago, and the community was very suspicious of any developer attempt to come in and preserve the property. And it was in the hands of a very bad developer, and POA needed to be able to take down this property so they could build the trust of the community. They needed to be able to have that quick win and say, we've got it, we're going to throw out the old management, we're going to turn it around and bear with us. And they were able to use a loan fund that we had put together in conjunction with some PRI capital from us to be able to do that. So in one case, it was we have a problem with the property. The other was we had a problem and we needed to build community trust. And in both cases, this capital was able to help them do that. So this is when we think about innovation in housing, I would argue that investing in organizations that lets them be strong and nimble often gets overlooked, but that is innovation. It is an innovation we don't think about because so much of the innovation we talk about is what happens to the bricks and mortar and not what happens to the person who's actually thinking and trying to create this opportunity. And I think that if we don't think about investing in organizations that are going to be long-term stewards of these properties, we're just setting ourselves up to be in this situation again and again and again. So that's the good news, but unfortunately, too many high-impact organizations struggle to try to attract the capital they need. And any of you who are housing organizations in this room have way more experience with trying to seek capital, I'm sure, and can speak to this. It's especially an issue in the housing field because it's so capital intensive. So when you think about what it means to try to attract the capital in order to address the needs in Chicago, we saw this with the money that we got from the federal government around foreclosure. It was like sprinkling jimmies on top of a cake, right? I mean, it barely went anywhere. And that's because the capital needs are so great relative to the problems. But when we think about what it means to invest, and again, we've chosen to invest in nonprofit developers. I want to be clear, I'm not indicating, trying to suggest that there are not good for-profit developers. It happened to be that this was the strategy that we decided that was worth focusing on for a variety of reasons. But investing in organizations that think about how to own housing not as a mechanism for profit, but as a long-term stewardship opportunity is really critical. And I think investing in organizations with a long-term, with patient capital, is a form of innovation that we don't talk about enough. I often like to say that I think that our impact investing is sort of the R&D in the field, right? We sort of take the risks and to try to demonstrate to the rest of the capital markets that these kinds of risks can be done. And I hope that ultimately the affordable housing sector can get to the place where the CDFI field is now. When the CDFI field started 20, 30 years ago, the vast majority of the capital came from foundations. It came from mission-oriented investors like myself. And now you can walk into Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley. They all have departments that invest in CDFIs. So that's the hope, is that at some point this field can get to a place where other capital sources see what the importance of investing in these organizations. Another key, as we think about, is try to think about ways to design new products around some specific housing needs, and particularly around trying to create, support innovation, but then also create pathways for new investors to come into those efforts. So I'm going to give an example of some of the new things that we've invested in recently. One is a real estate investment trust, or REIT, that was started by the Housing Partnership Network. I'll refer to it as HPET. It's not a very glamorous or easy name, but that's what it is. Housing Partnership Equity Trust, or HPET, was started a number of years ago, and we actually put $10 million of equity capital into this. It's also then invested in by 15 nonprofit housing members from across the country. And the goal was to try to create an organization that could acquire naturally occurring housing, primarily workforce housing, within the markets that they worked. Why is this important? Well, it's important, A, because it means that the organizations can diversify their assets. They can start serving people who are a little bit higher up in the income stream than what than they can serve through their primary tools like the low-income housing tax credit. It also means that they can get properties faster, that lets them start building their assets more quickly. As an example, the first property that was acquired using the REIT was a Mercy Housing property in an exurb of Illinois. They were able to acquire and close on the property in 45 days. So just for kicks, after the day after closing, I called Mark Angelini, the executive director. I said, Mark, how long did it take you to close on this other preservation deal that they had been involved in? 436 days. So now, they're not apples to apples, right? Because the one that they acquired is a property that was, it's tax credit, you're unwinding partnerships and all of that, I get that. But being able to acquire a property like this that was cash flowing day one, and where they can actually build in a plan to keep it as affordable housing, that's enormously transformative to those organizations. So, other thing that we did with that was that we also then created a liquidity facility. We invested $10 million. Citibank, Morgan Stanley, and Prudential were also investors. It was great. They blew through the capital in about 6 projects, right? So $100 million doesn't go as far as it used to. And they needed more capital. But the market wasn't ready to say, great, we'll sign on for an illiquid investment in a nonprofit-sponsored REIT. Someday we'll get our money back, we hope. So but they needed capital desperately. This is sort of the valley of death problem with growing companies. So what we did, because there were investors that wanted to come in, but they kept saying, but I need some evidence that there's liquidity there. That's what my credit committee says I have to have. So we created a liquidity facility. It's essentially like a put. So we provided our balance sheet and said, okay, $15 million. We will buy $15 million of the $50 million that needs to be raised if you invest in this organization. And there's sort of a period of time where it burns off. There's triggers that they have to go through. But not putting in any money, but essentially just putting up a $15 million promise, we were able to leverage $50 million from Schwab, Citi, and Morgan Stanley. And that was huge. And they can use that and they can leverage it and they can acquire more properties. They're still not there yet. I mean, they want to be $1 billion REIT, so they're going to have to raise a lot more capital. And they're going to have to be able to get big dollars of capital, because this is not going to be $100,000 at a time. But the fact that they now have big institutional investors that are stepping up, that are engaged, is a sign that this is actually something that the capital markets are starting to take seriously, and we think that that's really huge. So HPET now, I should say, has, just so I can give them their shout out, they've acquired 2,700 units in multiple states. Eden Housing just closed on a property in the San Francisco area. And it's a really amazing thing to think now that when you talk to the developers who are part of this, they say brokers are starting to call them because they know that they can close quickly. And that's enormous, because it used to be that, oh my God, Mercy Housing's calling me, it's going to take 463 days to close on that deal. And now they know that it doesn't, so that's a really big deal. So the work that we did around HPET and that we've done around some of the other investing we've done really demonstrates that we think that there are ways that we as foundations and impact investors can try to structure transactions to get past some of those things that's keeping capital on the sidelines. And I think that that's a really important thing that we have to keep focused on, and that's actually the pivot to what MacArthur is going to be doing next. We are actually in the process of leaving the work that's strictly focused on housing, so the portfolio of investments we have comes due in 2020, and hopefully they will all repay. But the goal that we want to do now is to say, let's take the lessons that we've learned, whether it's around housing or around any other field, and try to innovate around products that can actually help bring capital into the space, because there is capital out there that wants to come in, and it just doesn't always have the pathway to be able to do it because of some of these barriers that I've mentioned. So I'll give one last example for an innovation which has some housing relevance but gets at the point that we're talking about, because really when you break it and you strip away all these examples, what we're talking about is pooling capital to support innovation at scale. That's it, right? That's what we're all trying to do. And this is what we sometimes call, we're trying to, we MacArthur are trying to step in and help create a market for mission and try to help, what is it that we need to do? What's the key that unlocks the doors? So the last thing that I will talk about is there's a real estate fund in the southeast part of the United States. So don't think Atlanta, don't think Dallas. This is Tuscaloosa, this is Birmingham, this is, Shreveport. These are the secondary and tertiary cities in the southeast of the United States. These are not CRA hot markets. This is not where there's a lot of private philanthropic capital, but there's a lot of need, because every small city has one big project that needs to get done. It's a vacant office building downtown, it's a closed manufacturing center, it's something that needs capital. There's a group, the American South Real Estate Fund, that was put together, and that's exactly the mission that they were trying to address. And they had $100 million worth of pipeline deals in these smaller cities in the southeast that they wanted to get done. They needed a layer of impact capital to get them done. So we looked at this. They said, we have, MacArthur, we need your help. We have all these small foundations that want to come in, some individuals too. But we as a fund, I can't manage all these small investors. It's going to stretch us, it's too much. Is there some way we can work on this? So we looked at, this is one of our, sometimes you learn that the reason stuff hasn't happened is that it's really hard to do. So we thought we had created a structure to syndicate a PRI. So we made an upfront investment in the fund so that they could close, and the thought was we would syndicate that PRI to smaller foundations. Turns out syndicating a PRI is really tricky. Syndicating an MRI is even trickier, so we had to back off of that piece. But what we did do is we did create a structure that did let some smaller foundations come in. So even though it's not a pure syndicated structure, we were able to help work with the fund and help structure it in a way so that organizations now can come in at $500,000 to $1 million, which is great. And for many of these foundations, this is the first time that they've ever made an impact investment. We actually have one individual, a doctor in Pennsylvania of all places, who just thinks it's a cool idea. But he was able to come in, again, because of some of the help that we were able to provide with structuring this, and because of some of the way that we set up our initial capital investment. My point here is just that by playing a market-making role, by identifying some of the barriers that are keeping some of investors who want to come into these spaces out, we see this as a role that we can play going forward. Some of it will probably involve working on housing issues, but not necessarily from a programmatic perspective, but more from a standpoint of saying this is the way we have to think about what it is that we're doing. Because catalytic capital, which is sort of the sexy way that we're trying to talk about impact capital, catalytic capital means making market opportunities by basically taking the risks that the capital markets won't so that they can come in. And that's really important because there's way more private capital out there than there is in the impact capital space. We have to try to figure out a way to bring them together. And this is particularly important to talk about right now because The need is great. I can't remember now, I should know this off the top of my head, the dollar figure that was assigned to solving all the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, was $7 trillion or something like that. That's not going to be solved $1 to $3 million at a time. But at the same time, there's a growing sense that impact investors can have it all, that somehow we can maximize profits and we can also achieve social good. And certainly sometimes that's possible. But we have to be able to continue to have the conversation about why it is that maximizing profit, particularly when you're trying to house people, sometimes can be a conflict. And being able to say investing in housing is safe, therefore we can sustain it at a market level at a lower rate, has to be part of the story that I think we can tell, and I think through the continued investment we will be able to tell. So that's why we're committed to finding new ways to find other investors and to build upon what we've learned investing in the housing space to try to help bring in other people to share examples, to tell why we think what matters. And I'm just going to say one last piece because this is really important, because I think that when we think about the expression we use in philanthropy sometimes is everybody wants to pat the bunny, right? This is why Kiva works. Everybody wants to feel like they have one connection to one person and they've changed their life somehow. And I think that sometimes with housing, does us a disservice because we're talking about buildings. They're not cuddly. They don't matter in the same way that, you know, I was talking to somebody about the ring-tailed lemur, right? The ring-tailed lemur's cute and all that. But when we think about what it means to invest in organizations that can respond to crises, think about it, like nobody thinks about the crisis until the organization, you know, till you need it. That's part of the reason why investing in housing organizations matters. And being able to tell the story about why it is not just that the resident was helped, but why it was really important that a developer saw that need and anticipated it is really important. And I think as ourselves, we have to work on being able to not just talk about impact, but also talk about stories and why it matters. And so while I get incredibly excited about talking about the financial implications for organizations of investing in affordable housing projects, I did some research that talked about how some of the organizations we've invested in, their month's cash on hand has tripled in 10 years. Yes. My mother's like, what the hell are you talking about, right? So she still thinks I work in public housing, but that's okay. But being able to talk about why resilient organizations matter is just hard. So, but I think that we ourselves in the impact space have the ability to do both, to tell the personal stories, to bring in the investors, and that's the challenge that we're trying to do with the pivot that we're taking right now. And I certainly hope that everyone in this room will continue, because we all have to be part of this solution. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There's so many different pieces that I think I'd like to follow up on, and I know the crowd would like to follow up on, but we don't have all day. The first thing that came to my mind is actually a conversation that we had this morning around what is demanded of housing. You mentioned housing as a platform, but at the same time, the panelists earlier today said, well, if you keep adding things onto what housing is supposed to deliver, it becomes more and more costly and also all of a sudden is no longer affordable at the market level. How do you at MacArthur kind of deal with that potential conflict of making the platform more and more generous? Yeah, go ahead.
So this is on, okay. I didn't see a button, so I was worried. So I think that it's important to remember that housing can be a platform without something being served on top of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's really important, because when we think about service-enriched housing, which is obviously incredibly important, that's one way to measure the impact of housing. Simply having your child stay in a school for years and years at a time translates to educational outcome if somebody's not moving every time their rent comes, you know, their lease comes up. So I think that sometimes we think about, well, we have to measure housing impact in terms of what we've added to it, but just the baseline housing is enormously impactful. Being able to have your children in a place that doesn't have lead paint, for example, and you may not have lead paint as much of an issue here in California, but certainly in the Northeast and Midwest, it's huge. Knowing that your children aren't growing up surrounded by these types of negative environmental factors obviously helps things as well.
Yeah, so switching a little bit just to the general field of impact investing and so forth, you mentioned something that was really interesting about investing in organizations that are delivering impact. How much conversation at the foundation and other places like focuses on how you're measuring the impact of the impact on the organizations, right? Does that make it more difficult to provide those kinds of investments?
So this is always every conversation about impact investing invariably comes back to the impact and how are you measuring it. And it is an important thing to talk about why impact investing is that. Why are you getting impact potentially in return for a lower return? And when you're investing in organizations, it is hard because, again, they can be very intangible. The CDFIs have done it. And I still struggle with why it is that people see investing in CDFIs as impact, and somehow housing doesn't quite rise to that same level, and I just don't know quite why that is. But I think what it comes down to is being able to do two things. One, as much as I am a fan of financial metrics, you do have to be able to really ground what you're talking about in stories of individual people, because that's ultimately what people care about. And when you're talking particularly to individuals about why they invest in impact transactions, it's because of something, it's values driven, and it's why people feel that it's something that they can connect to. I give an example. We did all this research around the why housing matters to try to help broaden the tent to make more people care about housing. To say if we can have the unexpected champion who could speak up for why housing matters, that could actually help. And it does to a degree, and I think hospital systems in particular are now a great example of groups that now are starting to see why investing in housing is important. And part of that's driven by ACA and not having people return and be able to go into supportive housing. But what still is amazing to me is that even with all the research that we have, some people still, if it doesn't fit their mindset, they almost discount it. So I sat next to the head of 9 West Shoes at an event a couple of years ago, and I spent all this time, it was about housing, and I spent all this time talking to him about housing and why it was a platform for education, which is his big philanthropic thrust. And it was all fine and good, but what became very clear was he really was about crushing the unions. Because for him, education was just school reform, right? It was where the kids live is irrelevant. It's really about school reform. So unfortunately, sometimes there's still a disconnect.
Right.
And I think what has to come is there has to be a better way for us to translate research into the stories that people can understand and be able to kind of resonate with them.
Yeah, the point you made earlier as well that really resonated with me, and I think the audience, that most of the capital is in the private sector, right? And so one of the transformative roles a foundation can play is to help activate that capital for these kinds of investments. One thing you mentioned was this notion of why you chose to go with nonprofits in those moments was something about being a long-term steward. Is it a challenge, or what could be done about it to actually have for-profit developers to be the recipient of such kinds of investments when maybe their pro forma says we exit in 7 years? Is that holding it back? Is there something else that could be done to allow them, because in theory you might imagine they're actually more attuned to activating that private capital.
And there's certainly, again, and this has been a tricky thing that we've had to sort of navigate why nonprofits versus for-profits. And just to be very clear, because sometimes people get confused about this, PRIs can be given to for-profit institutions, for sure. So you don't have to be a B Corp, you don't have to be an L3C, you don't have to be anything like that, you can be a for-profit. Now it's a little trickier, and you have to be able to make it clear that this is not essentially subsidizing a higher rate of return for your organization, but you can do that. So we could have chosen to invest in for-profit organizations. There were a couple reasons for investing in nonprofits. A, it was the first time this was a new field for us, and so I think going with nonprofits certainly made our legal counsel, I'm not trying to blame the lawyers, but I mean, I think it was an easier execution for them to be able to do that. And also there were really strong networks of nonprofit organizations that were so involved in policy conversations that we really felt that was a very good alignment, since ultimately what we were trying to do is be able to have policy outcomes. We really wanted to use good examples of transactions that were being done by nonprofits to be able to help HFAs, housing finance agencies, et cetera, understand how to make different sources of capital work better with each other. And they, for whatever reason, were more focused on some of the policy and fixes that needed to be done. And candidly, they were also serving some of the harder populations than some of the for-profits were. And we wanted to make sure that we were including those types of properties in the conversation.
Hi, I'm Helmi Hisaruk, and I am the Director of Housing at the City of Los Angeles. And I really appreciated your talk. My question is, we're launching a naturally occurring affordable housing program in LA, and very interested in what you're talking about through HPET or HPT. How do you see, what role could governments play, local governments, in supporting that effort?
So there are some, that's a great question. And there are many local governments that are looking to try to replicate these models. The Twin Cities has one that they're, and I'm blanking on the name of it, but you could probably Google it pretty easily. But McKnight Foundation actually provided a $1 million grant to try to help get that fund off the ground, and then has also invested in it. There's a group in Chicago that's looking to do something similar. So there are models that people are looking at to try to help acquire properties in their jurisdictions, and it's complicated. I mean, typically then, in addition to helping kind of provide some of the framework and public support, oftentimes the funds actually then involve a layer of government support. So the one that's being put together in Chicago, we have money both from the city as well as from the state finance agency that's a top loss and is helping attract other capital to come in. And that's critical, but I think honestly creating the forum and helping convene people to have those conversations is a really important part of what the local government can do.
If there's the capital markets side of the foundation, I'm assuming making the returns by investing in for-profit, not nonprofit. Is there an effort then, as you just said, while you're looking to try and focus on nonprofits, to engage the partners you are taking your foundation money and trying to get them to align with what you're doing through this initiative?
So that's the 95% question. So what are we doing with the other 95% of the foundation's assets that we're not investing in impact investing? So this is when I have to, you know, those disclaimers when you have somebody from the Fed come and they say, I'm speaking as myself, I'm not speaking as a representative of the Fed. Yeah, that's disclaimer. So just read that into the record and say that I have no doubt that MacArthur Foundation's corpus is probably investing in developers who are acquiring year 15 properties and converting them to market rate housing. How could they not, right? Because they have $5.5 billion to invest. Would I personally like to be able to do that? Yes. I think the challenge that we hear a lot is that it's very hard for a foundation to invest $5.5 billion across a whole wide sector and not have some things end up in the hands of people who may be doing something at odds with your charitable purposes. We have the foundation has a investment policy that screens for things that says, we don't want to do harm and whatnot. We have not been able to specifically, not that I'm aware of, focus on this housing piece. So I don't have an easy answer, but it is certainly something that I think every foundation has to wrestle with, yeah. So I'm not sure that's a very satisfactory answer. I've worked there for 11 years and I still don't have a satisfactory answer to that question.
Well, I think that's okay. Today is about sometimes feeling uncomfortable with some of the challenges we face. And so, it's okay to end in that moment because that is some of the tension about how capital is being deployed and what it can mean in our communities, certainly as it relates to housing. So everyone, thanks again, Allison, for tremendous insights. Appreciate it. Thank you.